10,000 people here in Travis County believed to be HIV positive. Today on Austin Faith Dialogue, an important question on the AIDS crisis. Is the church responding? Please join us. Austin Faith Dialogue, a public affairs series at the crossroads of religion and life. Austin Faith Dialogue highlights the interaction of the religious community with the social and cultural issues in the area in and around the capital city. Austin Faith Dialogue is brought to you by Austin Metropolitan Ministries in cooperation with KTBC TV. Join us now for this week's edition of Austin Faith Dialogue.
Today, there's a good chance you know someone with HIV.
This AIDS public service announcement, sponsored by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, is becoming quite a common sight on most television stations throughout the country. And while many AIDS activists complain that the ad does not educate viewers properly about AIDS because it lacks information on how condoms can reduce the spread of the disease, it still has to be acknowledged that this is a response to the AIDS crisis by an important institution in our society, government. But what about another important institution, the religious community? Is the church responding to the AIDS crisis? Today, we will discuss this very urgent question with our guests. But first, let's get some background on the issue from Roger Lotz.
I do not have the AIDS disease, because I know a lot of you want to know that, but HIV virus.
I have known since the time of my brain operation in September 1988 that I have AIDS.
In the past year, these two men, Magic Johnson and Arthur Ashe, have become the leading spokespersons in the fight against AIDS. Their primary goal is to educate the public, and from figures released in March, that education is desperately needed. The U.S. Department of Health says 1 in every 250 people is infected with HIV, the AIDS virus. Locally, the city's Health and Human Services Department can only estimate that between 8,000 to 10,000 people are HIV positive in Travis County. Up to March 2nd of this year, there have been 922 cases of AIDS in Travis County. 597, or 65% of these people with AIDS, have died. Simply put, by the end of this program, 2 more people in the United States will have become infected with the AIDS virus, HIV. This past March, Magic Johnson used a cable television program to discuss the HIV virus and AIDS with a group of young people ranging in age from 8 to 14. It was an extraordinary program, especially when a young girl who is HIV positive spoke to Magic about her greatest fear.
I want people to know that we're just normal people.
Mm-hmm. Aww. You don't have to cry. You don't have to cry. Because we are normal people, okay?
This use of television in the fight against AIDS is a positive use of a major institution. But what about others, like the church?
In the 60s, many churches led the fight for civil rights. By the 70s, a number of churches were making their voices heard on the war in Vietnam. The church has always been a major force for social change in this country. And now we all face the AIDS crisis. And the question being asked by many is whether the church is playing a major role in this important health issue.
What mainline denominational programs are doing can be debated. In the mid-'80s, at the start of the AIDS crisis, many religious organizations wrote positive statements discussing AIDS. But some AIDS activists in the church, like the producer of this program, Scott Wintermute, feels the church as a whole has not done enough. He produced this program to highlight what he calls those special cases where individual churches made an impact with a program to help the needs of those with AIDS. Here in Austin, the help and services provided by the church may be better organized, thanks to this woman, Sue Bach. As director of the Regional AIDS Interfaith Network, it is her job to organize churches and synagogues with care teams. These teams go out and help people with AIDS with such things as picking up groceries. They may even help clean up the person's home, but their greatest impact is to be a friend. A church here in Austin with a model program is Manchac United Methodist Church. Their care team program was recently highlighted by a nationally produced television program. But as Sue Bach will tell you, much more work needs to be done.
That our society understands that the church has something to say that's healing and compassionate and non-judgmental about people in our society who have been marginalized. The people who spoke out early about this disease spoke in judgment and claimed that they represented everyone in the church, which in fact was not the case. But those of us who kept silent early on let them speak for us. And one of the things that I have learned from being involved with this program is that the church has a whole lot more to say and a whole lot more to offer. The church is a huge untapped resource.
We're now joined by our three guests for today's program. And through their expertise, we hope to discover how the religious community's response to the AIDS crisis may be augmented, and how constructive that response has been to the suffering of AIDS persons and those with HIV-positive syndrome. You will recognize our first guest from the introductory report. Sue Bach is director of the Regional AIDS Interfaith Network, or RAIN. The organization provides AIDS and HIV education to religious congregations. It also organizes care teams from churches and synagogues that provide practical services to people with AIDS, such as transportation, meals, and visits. Also joining us is Reverend Bob Huey, formerly pastor at Manchac United Methodist Church and director of TRAIN, the Texas Regional AIDS Interfaith Network, a project sponsored by the Texas Conference of Churches. Our final guest was profiled in the February 14th edition of the Austin Chronicle. The article described Penny Veers as a person whose world was blown apart by AIDS, but went on to say that she put her life back together again. Penny Veers is HIV positive, but that has not stopped her from leading a normal life. She's remarried and has 2 healthy children, and we thank you all for joining us. And Penny, I'd like to, because we were speaking at the end of the fact that you have been diagnosed with HIV positive, what it's like to know that you have this condition, how, you know, people have responded to you in regard to this, and how you feel about it.
Well, when I found out I was HIV positive, my husband was ill in the hospital and was dying, and I was more afraid of being alone without my husband than I have ever been about being HIV positive. Life was scarier without him. And that's how I've always felt about it. It's never been an issue to me to have HIV. I mean, I have a few problems physically with it, but in my mind, it's never been a problem.
I see.
It's like the sky's blue. I have HIV. It's no big deal.
Now, the public perception is that when you're diagnosed as having this particular condition, you may develop AIDS, but not inevitably. Is that the correct reading?
That's correct.
Mm-hmm. And so there is a fear that comes from having that to at least up to a certain extent.
I probably will get AIDS, probably. I feel pretty sure that I will, but it's okay if I get AIDS. I mean, it's okay. I'm still living. I'm still happy and going on with my life, and it's okay. I'm not afraid.
Okay. And you have remarried.
Mm-hmm.
And you have 2 healthy children that
yes.
I think is one of the signs that is encouragement to folks that to be diagnosed with this is not to quit leading a normal life.
Correct. Well, no, I did not have my children after my diagnosis. I have a 15-year-old and a 6-year-old,
mm-hmm.
And so they were born after my diagnosis. There is a possibility that my youngest could have gotten the virus from me, because 1 in 3 babies born to mothers who have HIV will get HIV.
I see.
That's a third. And so James was in the 2/3 that didn't get HIV.
Mm-hmm.
It was a real blessing, and I think my life perhaps would have been a whole lot different, and maybe my attitude about this would be a whole lot different had my baby been sick, because I do have friends who have babies who have since died and who are currently sick, and it is different. It's a hard thing to watch a baby be sick with this. It's a hard thing to watch anybody be sick with this.
I thought that film clip about Magic Johnson interviewing this child that knew that she was diagnosed with this was very touching.
Oh, yes, that poor baby. I just wanted to hug her. Yeah.
Right. Well, I think that the feelings that we have in regard to the condition as it applies to an increasing number of people is the compassion that is, I would guess, defined your ministry, Sue, with the RAINS, Regional, help me again with that.
Regional AIDS Interfaith Network, RAIN.
All right.
RAIN.
And you're trying to, it seems to me, give some organized response on behalf of the church communities.
Exactly. Churches and communities of faith historically, when someone in their congregation has a crisis, death in the family, an illness, some kind of tragedy or problem they need to deal with, the congregation has rallied around, taken food, run errands, done whatever they needed to do to help that family or that person over the crisis. And our program is designed to help people do that, from congregations do that with someone they didn't previously know, who probably will not be from their congregation, who has AIDS.
I see.
We're not asking people to do things they don't already know how to do. But part of the program has to be educating churches about how it impacts them and how it impacts our whole society in order to motivate them to provide this help to folks with AIDS.
All right. So you've been in Austin doing this for how long now?
The program has been in Austin since September of 1989.
And Bob, you've been in Austin since when? I mean, you've been a pastor here
about
before?
1985, most recently.
And you were at Manchac Methodist Church as pastor before taking your current position with Texas Conference of Churches.
That's right.
And again, there was reference to the fact that Manchac Methodist Church got some kind of national coverage on their ministry. What was that about?
That's right. Well, among the earlier congregations in Austin to invite RAIN to train care teams, Manchac stepped out and did that. And the first care team, I think, was a decisive event for the congregation. I think it's the first time many members of that congregation were educated about HIV disease, and it also involved a pretty broad spectrum of the congregation in terms of age, including some of the young people at Manchac. And because some of the young people at Manchac were involved, it's had an impact, I think, in preventive education about HIV for adolescents there.
Through the youth group of the church?
Right.
And you were instrumental in helping get that started. I mean, my guess is that without the pastoral leadership in that regard, it wouldn't have happened.
I think pastoral leadership is very important in either care team training or in preventive education in congregations. Congregations need to feel the support and encouragement of their pastors. And members of congregations whose lives are impacted by HIV disease, whether it's a family member or a loved one of a person who's HIV positive, those persons need the support and encouragement of their pastors. And there are various ways to do that. Speaking from the pulpit about HIV disease and a compassionate response, publishing things in newsletter, getting the word out very clearly to the congregation that persons with HIV disease or with AIDS are welcome in the congregation and that they are valued parts of the congregation. That's one of the things the church needs to be doing much more aggressively.
To help overcome the fears that people have about that.
That's right. Really, one of the first occasions I had to deal with this disease was a family member of a person with AIDS who did not tell us anything about her experience with her brother until he had died. And the reason she gave for not dealing with it was her fear of rejection by the congregation.
I see.
And so it's very important for the churches to do everything they can to help overcome the stigma that attaches itself to this public health issue.
All right. Penny, you're connected with church life here in town?
Yes, I do. I'm a member of St. George's Episcopal Church. Yes.
And what kind of response have you found in your church experience?
I've been Episcopalian all my life, and going to St. George's, it is a wonderful environment. They have a very welcoming environment for anybody who is infected or affected by HIV to come and worship and have their needs met, whatever they are. And every church in this country should be doing this, and anything less is just unacceptable. And I had a very bad experience early on in my diagnosis, and this was not with an Episcopal church, it was just another church where I went. It was a young congregation. I made friends with a couple there, and as this young woman that Bob had spoke of, I was afraid to share this part of my life because I didn't know what people were going to do. I mean, the things that I had experienced had already, some of them had hurt. And so some time went by, and then I made friends with this woman, and I did share with her all the issues about my life and what was going on, and she went back to the elders of the church, and they asked me not to come back. They were afraid, and they were afraid for my children, my son. They were afraid that he would have it, and he was in the nursery, and nobody wanted their kids in the nursery, and I offered them education. I had pamphlets and all the knowledge to offer them. And
they asked you to leave?
Yes, and they never, ever chose to be educated. And my comment was, you know, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when somebody in your church is affected by this. And what are you going to do? Are you going to do this to everybody? We're supposed to serve Jesus Christ in all persons, not just the people who aren't HIV positive. It's not printed like that.
Well, I have to give you a little subjective reaction to that. I guess we shouldn't be surprised or shocked that could happen and does happen. And did happen to you. It hurt very bad, and it took me a long time to get over it, because I thought since that church did that, all the churches were going to do that. And that feeling about yourself isolates you, and that's part of that isolation for people who have HIV and their family members because of those reactions and the way that you think about it afterwards. But I'm healed from it now, and it's no big deal, and everything's okay. Yeah.
So.
Well, I think that the wound that you suffered from that can be a benefit to the rest of us in terms of how people respond out of fear. It's the fear factor as much as the knowledge factor, it seems to me, that we're dealing with. You've got ignorance, the folks thinking that if your kids are in the nursery, they're going to spread the disease. But then you got the fear factor. They may know in their heads that that's not, they may read your pamphlets and think that that's not going to happen. And yet, when it comes to practice and their gut reaction, people are still responding like maybe in the early 1980s. Wasn't it in 1981 that the AIDS was first diagnosed in this country and having such a lethal effect?
For several years, the churches tried to respond sort of quietly to this disease. National church organizations wrote eloquent statements about compassionate ministry. Many local churches took actions that expressed compassionate concern, but we tried to do it quietly and behind the scenes for fear of reaction or backlash in society. For a while, I thought that was the best way to approach this, that somehow being quiet or silent in the midst of this would be helpful. But I've come to realize that silence feeds the fear that you're talking about. And that
better to talk about it.
And that it's better to talk about it, and it's better to even make mistakes than to remain silent. This is a disease that we don't have a long history with. I think we need to give people permission to make mistakes. And we need to give churches permission to struggle with this issue. And I think that's what most denominations are doing. It's dealing with some of the most intimate and sensitive issues that churches ever deal with. We've had to deal with homosexuality, and churches are struggling with that. We're dealing with adolescent sexuality, and churches are dealing with that. And there's a variety of opinion. There's a spectrum of opinion out there about the best response.
Okay, and I think that one of the responses that we could learn from, too, is, Sue, as you visit different churches, part of your task is to do education.
Right.
What kind of feedback do you get? Are you picking up on some of these fears as you talk to
Absolutely.
people?
One of the things that I find about our society is that we would just prefer to pretend that death does not exist. And I think Penny's attitude is really helpful when she talks about, I may get AIDS, it's not a big deal, because she's come to the understanding that we're all born with a terminal illness. None of us gets out of this alive. We are all going to die. Chances are, you know, it'll be an airplane crash or something that gets Penny before AIDS does. Gets me too. So we would like to be reassured that we can build a box and put ourselves and our children in that and be safe. So we want all these definitions to check off to be sure that it somehow doesn't affect us, and that's simply not the case. When we talk about AIDS, we have to talk about sex, drugs, and death. And people in society, just like people in churches, really prefer not to discuss that. When we begin to talk about...
You find that resistance often.
Right. And
Don't want to talk about it.
That's exactly right. And so basically what I do is just a little AIDS 101 to stamp out ignorance and fear, hopefully, bring people up to speed, good, current, accurate information on how difficult it really is to get this virus. You have to go to some trouble to acquire the virus.
What about people's attitude toward homosexuality? Does that get involved in it as well?
It enters into it. One of the things I try to tell people, however, is that we're dealing with a virus that's not an intelligent virus. It doesn't know if someone is gay or straight or black or white or old or young or rich or poor or anything else. It's a germ, and this is a public health epidemic. If a church is going to involve themselves in AIDS ministry, however, or somehow get involved in this, the issue of homosexuality may come up, and they probably need to have a parallel educational program going on with how the church deals with that, but to do it in the context of sexuality. Churches don't deal well with sexuality, period. And so to do a whole study for everyone, kids, teenagers, adults, on sexuality, how it's a good gift from God, but how do we deal with our sexuality in a responsible way, and then include homosexuality.
Well, I would like to just have a little minute here of more factual debriefing, for benefit of any of us who are still kind of piecing this together. Isn't it the case that because AIDS is a virus, is like any virus, that we don't have a cure for any virus?
That's right.
Much less for this particular one.
That's correct.
And this particular one has a particularly virulent form to it in terms of its mutations. Okay, now, if there is no hope at this stage for a cure, I mean, there's always hope for a cure, but there is no cure at this stage.
Right.
Then where does the hope come from? You see, this gets us into our spirituality.
Right.
Okay, I'd like to have you respond to that. So.
I have a wonderful relationship with God and my Lord. I know that that's what this program's all about. I'm not well versed in talking about that. I know how I feel in my heart, and I know what I say in my prayers, and I know what I receive when I read the Bible and when I meet people and I experience Jesus Christ in everybody, because that's really what we do, and all that makes me quite peaceful about this and not afraid, and dying doesn't bother me. It really doesn't bother me. I don't know how to say that anymore.
Coming to terms with your mortality is part of that.
Yeah, I guess I could say I've come to terms with my mortality. I think the hardest part, though, is letting go of my children. That has been the hardest part, is what do you do with your kids? You know, how is their life going to be after you're gone? Let's make good memories today, because what you do today is what you remember for tomorrow, you know, so we kind of live like that.
I see.
The other thing to remember is that we do know how to prevent this disease. We don't have to know where it came from. We don't even have to have a cure in order to have hope. We know how to stop the spread of the disease.
And that is?
Abstinence is the first thing. Our behaviors are what exposes us to risk in terms of the disease. There's plenty of information. Getting the information out and getting people to understand personally how it impacts them. Prevention is our only weapon right now.
Now, would prevention mean that every time people are considering a serious relationship, that they, before they enter into a sexual relationship, that they would have each other tested out?
Yes.
That would just be the part of the new morality, in a sense.
That's right.
And that would be the responsible thing to do for a partner that you say that you love.
Absolutely.
I've heard of some couples that you know, choose to go to get the blood test together and to receive the results together, and the counseling that goes along with that, as a way of affirming their mutuality in this and their support of each other It's hard to go be tested. It's a tension-filled time for a lot of people.
The anxiety.
And the anxiety's
what
tremendous.
the result's going to be.
But it's information we need in order to live responsible lives. So I encourage any sexually active person to be tested.
Absolutely.
And, you know, to exercise precautions in their sexual relationships.
All right. Well, I think, too, that we probably, at the end of the show, we're going to show a number of organizations that pertain to this. I think we also need to take note of the fact that church responsibility, discipleship, means to try to impact public policy as well as the personal kinds of things we've talked about, and that the cure for AIDS very well could still be out there in the future, and that's going to take some money. So that's a little additional thought to that.
We need that.
All right. And I'd like to thank all of our guests today, Penny Veers, Sue Bach, Rain, Reverend Bob Huey of the Texas Conference of Churches, for joining us and discussing this very important topic of AIDS and the religious community's response here in Austin. And before we leave you today, we want to provide you with a list of AIDS services here in town. Please remember, it isn't knowledge of the disease that's causing the spread of AIDS, it's our ignorance and fear.
Right.
I'd like to thank you for taking the time to watch today's program. Please join us again next week for another edition of Austin Faith Dialogue. Until then, peace be with you. For more information, call Austin Metropolitan Ministries at 472-7627.